So in this video, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how to work with timers. We're going to be using them for several activities. I'm going to create a Windows Form App.NET framework. This is important, the Form App.NET framework. And I'm going to click Next and create my project. And I'll call it Timer Demo. And make sure when you create your projects, create them on your X drive, submit folder. You don't have to make this project, but when you make your projects, make sure you put them on the X drive. And now it's going to make this project. Almost slow time. So here's my form application. And what I'll do here is, first thing I'll do, I always do this, is change the text on the top of my window. And I can do that in the properties panel down here. So if I select the form, I click on the form, now I get the properties for the form, and I can come down here and I can say, timer demo. I'll change the text on that and hit enter. Okay, so now we can see up here it says timer demo. And now let's add, I'm going to bring up my toolbox. So my toolbox is where my controls live. So under the view menu, I'm going to select toolbox, and I'm going to add a timer and some buttons and a text box. So let me put a text box on my form. And notice now the name of that control is text box 1. Maybe I'll go change the font for that. Maybe I'll click on the font property and maybe I'll make the font kind of big. There we go. Now my font's bigger. Maybe I'll make this thing a little bit bigger like that. And let's see, what else have we got in here? Do we have a text? I know there's a text align property, align text. I don't know. I guess I won't worry about. Oh, there it is, text align. I'll make that center. I'll make it right. I'll align it to the right. Okay. Now I'm gonna add some buttons on here. All right, so this is button 1. If I click on that, it says button 1. I'm going to change that to the text on that to say start. I'm going to change the text on that to be stop. And maybe I'll change this to say reset. Okay, so now I don't have my timer yet. I never made my timer. Let's find a timer control and drag that onto our form. Now you drag it onto the form, but it's not a visible control, so it won't show up on the form. It shows up down here at the bottom left, and you can see the name of our timer is timer 1. Now, timers do not have a lot of properties because they're not visible. We have an interval property, which is how many milliseconds this timer takes to tick, and we have an enabled variable or an enabled property that says whether that timer is on or off, whether this timer is running or it's not running. Now, both of these properties are controllable from code. So I'm going to double click on my controls now to have Visual Studio create the functions for them. So now I'm going to double click on my timer and I get a timer tick function. I'm going to double click on my start button. I get a button 1 click function for that. There's button 2 click and button 3 click. All right, so now let's start playing around with this. In my class, I'm going to make a variable called count, or maybe I'll call it ticks or something, and I'll set it to 0. And when my timer ticks, maybe I want to put this value into my text box. So I'll add ticks. I'll add 1 to ticks plus plus. That means add 1 to ticks. And then let's put ticks in text box 1. Text box 1 dot text. So go set text box 1's text property to ticks. Now ticks is a number. How do I convert it to a string? everything in C# has a toString function. So I don't need to use a conversion or something like that. Tix.toString, that would work. Okay. Now let's actually run this and see what happens. And you'll see that nothing happens because our timer is not enabled. We never started our timer. See, it just sits there, doesn't do anything. Okay, so how do we start our timer? Well, we could come in here and we could set the timer's enabled property and it would start running on its own. Let's go in here, and when the button 1 is clicked, let's start the timer. There's 2 ways to start a timer. You could set its enabled property to true. That would start the timer. Start the timer. That would work. You could also say timer1 dot start. They're the same thing. There you go. These do the same thing. However you want to think about it. And it's timer1 dot enabled. Oh, why is it not working? Timer1 dot enabled equals true. That property is a true false value. So you can either set the enabled property to true or false, or you could just call it start function. What does the start function do? It probably just sets the enabled property to true. All right. And what if we want to stop our timer? Well, guess what? It's just timer1 dot stop. Or we could say timer1 dot enabled equals false. Exact same thing. And what does button 3 do? Let's use button 3 for a reset. So let's set our, if we hit this button, let's set our ticks back to 0. And then let's refresh our text box. How do we refresh a text box? It's the name of the control followed by the property you want to change. So there's a text property in our text box, and we're going to set it to tix.toString. Tix.toString. Okay. So set the ticks to 0 and then refresh the picture box. So let's run this now and see what it does. Okay, there's our interface. And if I click stop, nothing should happen, right? Because the timer is not running. What if I click start? There, see, now it's running. What if I click stop? Timer stops running. There, hey, it works. Okay, so and now if I click the reset button, notice it resets my timer there. What if now what if I wanted to change the interval, how fast or slow my timer runs? Well, that's the interval property on the that's the interval property on the timer. So what could I do to make this just a little more interesting? Let me pull up my toolbox and let me add a checkbox onto my form here. And I'll change the text property to, run slowly or something like that. So now if this box is checked, the timer shouldn't run as fast. So let's double click on this. So when somebody checks that box, the timer will, we can change the timer interval. So let's say if well, how do we ask this control if it's checked? Let's find out. If checkbox1 dot checked, so there's a checked property on that thing, is true. So is that we're supposed to run slowly? How do we change the timer's interval? Timer1 dot, let's look at the properties in the timer. Dot interval equals 1,000. That'll be 1 second. Otherwise, else, set the timer's property to 100. Why is it griping? Oh, not enabled. Interval. Enabled is either true or false. The interval is the number of milliseconds. I just tabbed the wrong thing. Okay, timer1's interval is now 1,000. Timer1's interval is now 100. Let's run this and see what happens. So let's start our timer. And you can see it slowed down. Let me uncheck that. And it speeds up again. So that's pretty much all there is to working with timers. Timers have an interval property, which is how many milliseconds it takes for their timer to elapse and trigger the timer tick function. And the timer can be started and stopped using either the start and stop function or the enabled function. If you set the enabled property to true or false, you can also start and stop the timer that way. So those two properties that you see in the inspector and the properties panel, enabled and the interval, you can set those both in code. These are the exact same thing. So there's examples of how to set the timer's interval in code. Here's examples of how to start and stop your timers in code. So there you go. That's pretty much all there is to working with timers.